All right, let's dive into one of the most revolutionary and, controversial ideas in the entire history of music. We're talking about Arnold Schoenberg's 12-tone system. So, to really get why Schoenberg's idea was such a big deal, you have to start with this question. See, for centuries, music had a very clear home. But right around the turn of the 20th century, well, it started to feel a little bit lost.
And this brings us to a real crossroads. Composers were genuinely facing a crisis. I mean, the system of rules that had been the bedrock of Western music for centuries, it was being stretched to its absolute limit.
That system? It's called tonality. And honestly, the best way to think about it is like musical gravity. Every single piece had this central note, a home base, that kind of pulled all the other notes and chords back to it. It's what gives you that satisfying feeling of arrival, of resolution.
But composers started pushing back against that gravity. You had folks like Wagner, the late Romantics, who were creating harmonies so incredibly dense, so complex, that finding that home base became, well, almost impossible for the listener. And then on the other side, you had Impressionists like Debussy, who were kind of just floating through these amazing harmonic worlds, not really caring about a central key at all. So you can see, the whole system was starting to crack.
So right into the middle of this musical identity crisis walks our guy, Arnold Schoenberg. And he had a pretty radical take. He believed that for music to even survive, you couldn't just put a Band-Aid on the old system. Nope. It needed a brand new operating system, from the ground up.
And look, this wasn't something he just cooked up overnight. His whole career was basically a journey to get to this point. He starts out as a late Romantic, right? Pushing the old system to its absolute limits. Then he dives into his atonal phase, where he famously emancipated the dissonance, basically freeing chords from having to go home. But that kind of freedom can be chaotic. So for his next act, he unveils his big idea, a new method to bring some structure back into this wild new world.
And this is so important to get. For Schoenberg, this was about saving music, not destroying it. He truly felt that the old tonal system had just run out of road. It had said everything it could possibly say. So for him, this crazy new idea wasn't about tearing things down, it was about building a future for music. Okay, so how in the world does this system actually work? Well, probably the best analogy is to think about it like musical DNA. At the very heart of this whole thing is something called the tone row. So what is it? It's just a specific order of all 12 notes in the scale. But here's the crucial rule. You can't repeat a note until you've used all the other 11. And that one single row, that becomes the genetic blueprint, the DNA for the entire piece. Now, once you have that musical DNA, you get to play with it. There are 4 main ways to transform it. You've got the original, which they call the prime form. Simple enough. Then you can play it straight up backwards. That's the retrograde. You can also flip all the intervals upside down, which gives you the inversion. And then for the grand finale, you can play that upside down version backwards. And that, my friends, is the retrograde inversion.
But wait, it gets even cooler. This is where the whole thing just explodes with possibilities. You can take each of those 4 forms, the original, the backwards, the upside down, and the backwards upside down, and start them on any of the 12 pitches. You do the math. That gives the composer a toolkit of up to 48 different versions of the row, all from that one single starting idea. That's a lot to work with. Okay, so Schoenberg creates this beautiful, logical system. Problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. Just because he built it didn't mean everyone came. In fact, his solution basically ignited one of the biggest, most passionate debates in all of 20th century art.
And the whole debate really boiled down to one thing. Does this stuff actually make sense to the ear? Can you, as a listener, actually perceive the structure? Or is it just a super clever intellectual puzzle on paper that, sounds like random noise?
So you had critics like theorist George Pearl, who basically said, look, this system just doesn't work. He argued that it completely fails to connect the melody, what you might call the horizontal part of music, with the harmony, the vertical chords. For him, it just sounded totally disconnected, like 2 separate things happening at once that had nothing to do with each other.
But Schoenberg, of course, had an answer for that. He fired right back, arguing that he'd actually created what he called a unitary perception of musical space. What does that mean? Well, for him, melody and harmony weren't separate at all. They were just 2 different ways of looking at the exact same thing, the tone row. So, you've got the academics and the high art composers all arguing back and forth. But while they were doing that, this super intellectual, kind of nerdy system started to find a life of its own, and in some places you would never expect.
I mean, sure, it had the legacy you'd probably predict. A ton of the 20th century's most important classical composers. We're talking giants like Stravinsky and Copland. They eventually came around and started using it. So it definitely cemented its place in the world of the avant-garde.
But its journey did not stop there, not by a long shot. In fact, I'm willing to bet you have heard this music way more often than you realize.
Yeah, that quote is from Scott Bradley. And who's he? Oh, just the musical genius behind the classic Tom and Jerry cartoons. It turns out he realized that 12-tone music, with its constant tension and lack of a home bass, was the perfect sound for all that crazy, chaotic, surreal slapstick happening on screen. It was literally the perfect soundtrack for a cat chasing a mouse.
And that just leaves us with this one kind of amazing final thought, right? You have a system that was designed to bring this intense, logical structure to the highest of high art, and it also becomes the go-to sound for cartoon chaos. It really makes you wonder, what does a word like dissonance even mean? Maybe it's just the sound of old rules breaking and new ones being written.